Wyoming Territory, 1883. The baby's cries echoed through the rafters long after the sun dipped behind the mountains, sharp and aching like a wound that would not close. The hayloft smelled of warm dust and horses, and Virginia Sutton sat hunched on a threadbare quilt, her arms wrapped protectively around her 3-month-old daughter, Sadie. The wind outside howled through the slats of the old barn, and the baby wailed louder, tiny fists clenched, face red and wet. Virginia rocked her gently, whispering soft nonsense into her ear, but nothing helped. She was bone-tired. Her dress stuck to her skin with sweat, streaks of straw clinging to the folds. Her back ached from leaning against the wooden boards, and her arms trembled from holding the baby for hours. There was no comfort left in her. Just fear. Just shame. Just the pounding truth of her situation. She was alone. The ranch hands had all turned in for the night, the bunkhouse dark. She had not asked for help. She never did. But someone was awake. Boots crunched in the dirt below. She stiffened, clutching Sadie tighter. The barn door creaked open, and a lantern cut through the dark. Its glow landed on a tall silhouette, coat dusted with trail dirt, hat low over his brow. He paused, listening. Virginia. His voice was deep, steady, familiar. She blinked. Kade Rowell, the cowboy from the south field. The one who never said much, but always tipped his hat with a quiet kind of respect. The one who had brought her water last week when the sun had nearly taken her down. The one who fixed her chicken coop without being asked. He looked up toward the loft, lantern raised. I heard the baby crying. Thought maybe you needed help. Virginia hesitated. She pressed Sadie to her chest and whispered, "Shoo, sweet girl." But the baby only screamed louder. The ladder creaked under Kade's weight. You do not have to, she began. But he was already climbing into the loft, careful with the lantern, his boots thudding softly on the boards. Once he stood beside her, he did not say anything right away, just knelt down and looked at her with steady eyes. He was not judging. He was not gawking. He was just there. I tried everything, she whispered. She will not settle. He set the lantern down, took off his hat, and sat beside her. Let me help. She stared at him, uncertain. You ever hold a baby before? He gave a small shrug. No, but I can learn. Virginia studied his hands, rough, calloused, sun-darkened. The hands of a man used to mending fences and breaking horses, not cradling infants. Still, she passed Sadie over, her arms trembling. Kade took her with surprising gentleness, his big hands awkward but careful. Sadie squirmed, hiccuped, then let out another wail. Kade winced. All right, little one, he said softly. You got a strong set of lungs. He bounced her slightly, rocking her the way he had probably seen mothers do. Virginia watched, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Kade looked up at her. You eat today? She shook her head once. You sleep? Another shake. He nodded slowly. Then that's part of it. She feels how worn out you are. He rocked Sadie again, his arms starting to move with more confidence. Let me hold her a while. You rest. Virginia wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. I cannot sleep. Not with her crying like that. Kade shifted so she could lean against his shoulder. Then just sit. Close your eyes. Let me take some of the weight. She did not lean at first, but then her exhaustion won. She let her head rest against him, her body sagging with relief. She closed her eyes. The crying softened. A hiccup. Another small wail. Then quiet. She looked down. Sadie's eyes were half-lidded, her tiny fists loosening. You are a miracle, Virginia whispered. Kade chuckled under his breath. Far from it. But I reckon if a horse can be gentled, so can a baby. She smiled faintly. You always this calm. I have seen storms come fast. Learn not to panic when they do. She liked that about him. He did not rush. He did not push. He just showed up, steady as the earth. The barn creaked around them. Wind whistled through the slats. But in the loft, it felt still. Safe. Virginia sighed. I have not heard her this quiet since she was born. I reckon she knows she is not alone. That hit her harder than she expected. She looked up at him. Neither am I. Not tonight. Kade met her gaze. His eyes were warm in the lamplight. Not anymore. They sat like that a long while, her leaning against him, Sadie asleep in his arms. When the lantern began to dim, Kade adjusted his grip on the baby and said, Come morning, we will get you out of this loft. You and her both. Virginia frowned. I do not want charity. It is not charity, he said simply. It is care. She looked at him carefully. Why do you care? He hesitated, then said, because I see you. You are trying hard. You are doing it alone. And you do not have to. Virginia's heart beat heavy in her chest. She had not been seen in a long time. Not really. Kade stood slowly, still holding the baby. Come on. Let's get her to a bed. I do not have one. You do now, he said, already heading toward the ladder. Virginia followed, barefoot, arms wrapped around herself. And when she stepped down into the dark barn and saw Kade waiting with Sadie held close to his chest, something unspoken settled between them. He was not just helping for the night. He meant to stay, and for the first time in a long time, Virginia felt like maybe she could stop running. Maybe, just maybe, she had finally found someone who would not leave. And he had found her, in the middle of the night, in the hayloft, when her baby cried and no one else came. But he did. The bunkhouse sat quiet behind them, its windows dark and still, as Kade led Virginia toward the small shed tucked behind the main house. He kept his steps slow, careful not to jostle Sadie, her breath soft against his shirt. Virginia followed close, arms drawn around herself, her shift hem dragging faintly in the dirt. Her boots were still up in the loft. He didn't mention it. The shed door creaked open beneath his hand. Inside, the air held the faint scent of sun-warmed pine and dry wool. A narrow cot sat against the far wall, layered with folded quilts. A pine chest rested at its foot. Kade had cleared it out last week when the farrier left ahead of the cold nights. He set Sadie down gently in the crook of the cot, his hands steady. Virginia stood at the threshold, her eyes darting over the room. She kept her weight on one foot, as if halfway between staying and fleeing. You can have this for now, he said, voice low. It's warmer than the loft. I'll bring water and firewood come morning. She stepped inside, slow as dusk. You didn't need to give me your space. I've got canvas and sky, he said simply, and enough years under both to know what matters. She looked down at the cot, then at her daughter, now sound asleep. I don't know how to thank you. You're not obliged to, he said. But if you want to talk, I'll listen. She eased onto the edge of the cot and pressed a hand to Sadie's blanket. My husband's name was Thomas. We came out from Illinois last spring with a letter from a cousin near Cheyenne. But by the time we reached Rawlins, the fever had taken him. Kade didn't speak, just stood still, hat in hand. I tried to get work at the mercantile, but they wanted someone without a child. She looked up. I took the job in the kitchen here because no one asked questions. I didn't plan to stay long. You're honest, Kate said. That's more than most start with. Her eyes held his with something like surprise. You don't think I'm reckless? Foolish. I think you did what you had to. She pulled the quilt up over Sadie's small form, then brushed a curl from her cheek. She cries most at night. I think she misses him, even if she never met him. Babies feel more than folks give them credit for. Virginia leaned back against the wall, her shoulders sinking slightly. I used to sing her to sleep. But my voice, she shook her head. It's gone thin. Kade reached for the kettle tucked on the shelf. I'll heat some water. There's a kettle hook behind the barn. You'll feel steadier with something warm in you. She didn't argue. Instead, she watched him go, as if memorizing the lines of his back. By the time he returned, steam curled from the tin cup in his hand. She took it with both hands, eyes closing briefly over the warmth. He sat across from her on the pine chest, their knees a breath apart. I thought I could manage this alone, she said quietly. But it's a kind of hollow you can't fill by yourself. You're not by yourself anymore, he said. If you want me here, I'll stay. She looked up, her face unreadable for a moment. Then she gave the smallest nod. Kade took off his coat and laid it over the foot of the cot. You get some rest. I'll keep by the door a while. She didn't stop him, didn't ask for more. But when she lay down and pulled the quilt up to her chin, she looked toward him once before closing her eyes. Outside, the wind had quieted. The night settled low and still. Kade leaned back against the wall and folded his arms. He could hear Sadie's breath, soft and even, and Virginia's not far behind. He didn't move. Didn't need to. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Morning came slow and pale, brushing the sky with thin streaks of gold behind the hills. Kade stood outside the shed, arms crossed, watching the light creep over the frost-hardened ground. The air smelled of cold pine and iron soil. A crow called from the cottonwoods near the creek, its cry sharp against the hush. Inside, Virginia stirred. A soft rustle, then the low creak of the cot. Kade knocked lightly on the doorframe with his knuckle. "You decent?" She opened the door a crack, hair braided back, cheeks still carrying sleep. "Come in." He stepped inside and set down a small tin plate of cornbread and dried apple slices. "Cook let me take some before the others came in." "You ought to eat while it's warm." She took the plate, nodding once. "Thank you." Sadie was awake too, blinking from her bundle of wool and cotton, fists waving quietly in the early light. Virginia scooped her up, settling her against her shoulder. Kade pulled a chair from the corner and sat with his elbows on his knees. "I asked the foreman if you could stay on. Told him you've been working the kitchen since June. He said you could help mend tack in the shed once your feet are under you. Said it's quiet work, pays some." She blinked, surprised. "You spoke to him?" "This morning. Just now." He didn't argue. She let that sit between them before saying, "You didn't have to do that." "I know." Virginia looked down at her daughter. "I've never mended tack. Not proper." "I'll show you," he said. "It's mostly thread and patience." She gave a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "I've got one of those." Kade leaned back slightly. "You ever ride?" "Not since before Sadie. We had a mule cart back home. Took it to town for flour and soap. I missed the way the road used to open up before us. There's a brown mare in the north pen. Older, steady. Wouldn't spook if a hawk landed on her. When you're ready, I'll saddle her for you." Virginia looked at him carefully. "Why are you doing all this?" "I figure if someone's trying to stand, they shouldn't have to do it on shifting ground." She didn't look away. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing you don't want to give." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It held weight, but not pressure. After a moment, she said, "I don't know what I have left to give." "You feed her. You keep going." "That's something." Virginia moved to the chest and took out one of the folded quilts, laying it across the cot again. "I thought if I could just last through winter, maybe I'd find my feet again." "You will." He stood and opened the door wider, letting in more of the morning light. "There's coffee on the fire if you want it. I'll be in the corral till noon." She watched him go, Sadie tucked against her. As the door clicked shut behind him, she sat back down, the weight in her chest a little lighter than it had been the night before. She didn't know what shape her life would take now. But the emptiness was no longer hollow. It had edges. It had possibility. And someone had seen her. Not as a burden. Not as a body to pity or pass by. But as a woman still standing, still trying. Outside, the wind tugged softly at the eaves. And for the first time in months, Virginia didn't brace against it. By the third week of October, the frost came hard overnight, leaving the grass brittle and silver at dawn. Kade found Virginia in the tack shed just after breakfast, sleeves rolled to her elbows, needle between her fingers, a piece of cracked harness leather spread across her lap. Sadie lay in a basket nearby, wrapped snug with a knitted bonnet one of the older ranch wives had lent her. "You're keeping your stitches straight," Kade said, crouching beside the bench, watching her hands move. "You've got a feel for the grain already." Virginia didn't look up. "You said it was patience." "I've got that in spades." "I didn't say you'd get this quick." She pulled the thread through and tied off the end before glancing at him. "I used to mend my father's boots when I was 12. He'd wear them to holes before asking me." Kade lifted the strap gently, testing the seam with a thumb. "You trust your hands." "I had to." She returned the needle to the tin box and wiped her palms on her skirt. "When I was little, I'd watch my mother draw the needle like she was lacing up the world. I didn't understand it then." "You've got her hands?" "No." Her stillness, maybe. She shifted her weight, looking toward the doorway where the wind stirred a length of old rope. "She passed 2 winters back. Pneumonia." Kade rested his elbows on his knees. "Was she kind?" Virginia's mouth pulled into something close to a smile. "Not always. But she loved us hard. Took in neighbor kids when their folks were sick. Had a way of making biscuits when flour was almost gone. She'd say, 'You can't starve on bread if you've got hands to make it.'" He nodded slowly. "Sounds like she'd have done fine out here." "She'd have hated it," Virginia said, brushing a curl from her cheek. "Too dry. Too far from town. She liked to talk, and the prairie don't answer back." Kade chuckled under his breath. "It'll listen, though, if you speak plain." Virginia leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. "That why you stay so quiet?" "I talk when there's something worth saying." She gave him a look, half amused. "And is this worth saying?" He met her eyes. You've got a steadiness I admire. She looked away, color rising faintly in her cheeks. That's not what most folks see. They see a widow with a crying child and no husband to name. I see a woman who didn't fold. The wind picked up just then, rattling the shed door faintly on its hinges. Sadie stirred but didn't wake. Kade stood, walking to the door, then paused. I'm heading to the south field later. Cattle need checking before the snow comes. She stood too, brushing off her skirt. You ride alone? Usually. Virginia hesitated. Could I come? He turned, brows lifted slightly. Not far, she added. Just to ride. Just to feel something move under me again. He studied her a moment. You'll need boots. I'll find them. He nodded once. I'll saddle the mare. By early afternoon, the sun had warmed the frost to a soft dampness. Virginia stood by the corral fence with Sadie nestled in her arms, a borrowed shawl wrapped around them both. One of the kitchen girls had offered to mind the baby for a few hours, and Virginia had accepted, though not without a long moment of hesitation. Now, Kade waited with the brown mare already saddled, reins loose in his hand. Her name's Dot, he said as he helped Virginia up. Don't ask why. She came with it. Virginia settled into the saddle slowly, adjusting her skirt and gripping the horn. She's taller than I remember horses being. She's calm. Keep your heels in and your eyes ahead. They rode south along the fence line, where the land buckled gently, tall grass giving way to patches of shale and the occasional sage thicket. Neither of them spoke much. The hooves made a soft rhythm in the dirt, and the air carried the smell of dry grass and distant smoke. After a while, Kade drew his horse closer. You ride easy. It's coming back. He glanced sideways. You feel different up there? I feel taller, she said. I didn't expect that. They stopped at the ridge where the land opened wide, the mountains rising faint and blue in the distance. Kade dismounted first and offered his hand. Virginia took it, sliding down with a firm grip. They stood side by side, looking out over the stretch of country. A hawk circled overhead, slow and deliberate. It's quiet, she said. It's honest, he replied. She looked up at him then, something cautious but clear in her gaze. You're not like any man I ever knew. I don't know if that's good. It is, she said, voice steady. It is. Kade didn't move, but his eyes held hers for a long moment. Then he said, I'd like to be close to you, Virginia. Not just in the barn or the shed. I'd like to know what you carry and where you're headed. She didn't look away. I don't know where I'm headed, but I know I don't want to go alone. He nodded once, slow and sure. Then we won't. The wind tugged lightly at her shawl. She stepped closer, not touching him, just standing beside him with her shoulder near his. They watched the horizon together, and though no words passed between them after that, a quiet understanding settled in the space between their breaths. Neither of them had planned for this, but it had come anyway, quiet and steady as the land beneath their boots. The first snow came in soft and early, not enough to choke the trails, but enough to mute the world. The flakes drifted steady through the air, catching in Virginia's hair as she stepped out of the shed with Sadie bundled against her chest. The child's breath was warm against her collarbone, her eyelids fluttering in sleep. Virginia stood still a moment, watching the flakes settle on the fence rails and the horses' backs, the quiet of it reminding her of Christmas mornings back east before everything had gone thin and quiet in a different way. Kade came around the side of the barn with a coil of rope slung over one shoulder, his coat dusted white. He stopped when he saw her, and something passed across his face, something gentle and certain. You get out here? He asked. Just needed to breathe, she said. He walked to her side. You're not used to the snow yet. I forgot how quiet it makes everything. She's warm. Virginia looked down at Sadie's tiny mittened hand peeking from the blanket. She's snug as she's ever been. Kade reached out, adjusting the shawl over the baby's back. His fingers lingered just a breath longer than necessary, not on her skin, but near enough that Virginia felt the shape of his care. You've got the look of someone who's been thinking hard, he said. She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, I've been offered a room in town. The preacher's wife, she heard I was widowed, and said there's space above the church school. Said I'd be welcome to help with the younger children come spring. Kade's jaw tightened slightly. You considering it? I thought I might, she said, voice measured. It'd be steadier than ranch life. Quieter. He nodded once. Sounds respectable. But I'd miss the sound of the wind through the cottonwoods, she added. And the way Sadie sleeps better when she hears the horses. And I'd miss you. Kade didn't move, but his eyes stayed on hers. I'd miss you back. Virginia shifted Sadie in her arms. I'm not used to choosing things for myself. Not since before Thomas fell ill. Everything since has just happened to me. You don't owe me anything, Kade said. I know, she replied. That's why I want to stay. Not because I must. Because I want to. He stepped closer then, slow and sure. If you stay, I'll build you something with more than one room. Walls thick enough to hold heat. A place where Sadie can grow without want. Virginia's breath caught. You do all that. I've already started, he said. Back near the creek line, where the cottonwoods bend. I didn't want to press you, but I've been laying the frame when time allows. Her hand clutched the edge of Sadie's blanket. You thought I'd stay? I hoped, he said. But I only want you to if your heart's settled. She looked up at him, eyes shining with something quiet and fierce. It is. He reached for her, then not sudden, but certain. His hand came to rest at the small of her back, his other lightly beneath Sadie for balance. Virginia leaned into him, her forehead brushing his chest. Snow clung to their coats, but they didn't notice. I didn't think I'd feel safe again, she whispered. You are, he said. With me, you always will be. She looked up, and he bent to kiss her slow, warm, and full of everything they hadn't said but had lived through side by side. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't fiery. It was something better. It was real. That night, they shared supper by the stove in the shed, Sadie asleep in her basket, the stew warm and thick in their bowls. Kade had brought it down from the bunkhouse kitchen, and Virginia had added the last of her dried sage to the pot. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. By the time spring came, the house by the creek stood finished, its roof tight, the porch deep enough for a rocker. Kade had carved their initials into the beam above the door, small and private, where only she would see. They married in early May, under the cottonwoods before the leaves fully unfurled. The foreman stood witness, and the cook's wife brought wildflower bread and honey from her cellar. Virginia wore a dress dyed soft sky blue, stitched at the hem with thread she'd traded for herself. Kade wore the same coat he'd worn the night he found her in the loft. The vows were short, but their eyes said the rest. When he kissed her there before the trees, her hand curled into the back of his neck and stayed. Sadie toddled by then, clinging to the hem of her mother's skirt, her bonnet slipping sideways in the breeze. Kade lifted her into his arms as they walked back toward the house, Virginia's hand in his, and the three of them crossed the threshold together. They built a life that was quiet in the best ways. Mornings with coffee and sun through the windows. Evenings with Sadie curled between them while the wind whispered through the eaves. Work was steady, and so was the love that grew between them, not rushed, not forced, but strong as cedar and just as lasting. They never left the ranch. Never needed to. And every winter after that, when the first snow came, Virginia would open the door just long enough to breathe it in, then turn back and find Kade waiting, ready to hold her close.